right, welcome everyone to our Designing with Criticality and Love lecture series hosted by Type Electives. We have a series of amazing people, news stories, new and established voices in design that will share their stories, knowledge, and ideas with us. And this is all part of sort of like to create and expand this community. So moving forward to the next slide, let me tell you a little bit about the school. We are Type Electives. Lynn and I are the people behind it at the moment. And our mission is to offer classes that are non-traditional to type design, and also to create a community of learners, people interested in sort of like, shaping the future of type with a lens of criticality and love, which is the theme of our lecture series. So we have a lot of events going on. Today, especially, we have an amazing talk by Schessa, who will be speaking in a few minutes. Thank you all for coming. Please tell your friends. If you're in New York City, this is our first in-person event, which is happening in Brooklyn, Gowanus, at a Principal's GI Coffee House. So if you're around, please stop by. I think the event is already sold out, but little secret, you can still come. But yeah, do let us know if you make it. We'd love to say hi and meet you, obviously, in person. So come. There's a free workshop, and we're planning things online as well. So just stay tuned. We also have a few more events coming up. One that is fresh, we haven't announced yet, and we'll be doing it soon. Next week, next Friday, we have a really interesting panel on scholarships and mentorships with Chantal Malie and Veronica Burian. So invite you all to come as well. Tell your friends, tell your students, anyone who is studying type design, who is interested in mentorships or scholarships. This is going to be a really good one to be informed. And down the road, a few upcoming talks. We have Libby Bishop, the person behind 52 Weeks of Fonts. She's also just finished teaching a class on crash course in type design. So if you're interested in the process behind type design, please come to that talk. David Walker will be talking about lettering from a more personal and like emotive perspectives. If you haven't looked at his Instagram, you should definitely follow him. He'll be telling us all about his process and from personal, but also technical stuff. And Jen Ramirez, he's a very talented sign painter, graphic designer, type designer. He will be telling us about his process as well and how he approaches his work through the many community events that he also leads. So we have a lot of things happening this week and the upcoming week. So please help us spread the word. We hope you can join us. These are all free. So tell your friends, and let's all get together and share with each other. I think you're muted, Lynn.
Classic. Thank you. All right. I hope you are all as excited as I am. I assume so. You're all here for Schessa. I am very honored to do the introductions for Schessa. Schessa Garbutt is a Brazilian American creative polymath and founder of Firebrand Creative House based in California. Their design practice focuses on brand identity and UI UX design for social impact initiatives and mission-driven organizations. They are also an essayist and lecturer speaking on diversifying design history and co-design practices at universities and organizations such as IDEO, SF Design Week, MICA, Where Are the Black Designers, and Adobe's Wireframe podcast. Schessa holds a BA in design from the University of Southern California and a certificate in type design from Type West. And as you all might be aware, they are the instructor for the class that just wrapped up for us, Provoking Type. And we are hoping to plan another one later this year. So please stay tuned. I'm sure all of you are very excited about it. And so after the talk, we'll have some time for open Q&A. So if you have any questions, please drop them in the webinar QA tab or the chat in case you can't find it. Juan and I will be behind the scenes uploading them into the QA if you can't find that. So without further ado, please welcome Schessa.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lynn. I'm going to switch over. Can you guys all see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, let's jump in. So hello, thank you so much for coming and sharing space with me, hearing about my work. I'm so excited for this talk, but also for this speaker series in general. I love the combination and the balance of criticality and love. I think for me, a lot of my writing work and teaching work does come from a critical place, does come from a critical lens, but that's only because there's so much love and passion for me behind it and behind design history and the ways that we pull those things into the future. So I'm going to talk more about that today. But my name is Schessa. My pronouns are they, them. And I am calling in from Tongvaland, which is currently known as Los Angeles. Today is a very auspicious day for type designers, actually. It's Mario Day, March 10th. So it's a high holy day for us type nerds and visual pun people. So I'm going to talk a little bit about who I am and my positionality, the type/design continuum, shout out to Afrovisualism, decentering whiteness in our design practices, especially as queer or non-white designers, and then my work and how I do that in a very practical way. So this is a little bit of me and my intersections. I'm a designer. I'm somewhere between a designer and an artist. So I do brand and website design for my day job, but I also create personal pieces that are lettering and type design and illustration. As Lynn and Juan mentioned, I currently teach at type electives, and we just wrapped our class Provoking Type. Some of the students are here and they are so incredible. They just gave their, last week they gave their final presentations about the things that they learned from the course and how they want to apply those to their own practices and their own projects. And it was so amazing to see people tapping into their own identities, their own design lineages, their own ancestral relationships to type and writing systems. And a lot of my teaching is rooted in my writing practice. Provoking Type, the name of the class, is actually based on an essay that I had written 2 years ago, 2 years ago, about my experience learning about type design and learning type history. I'm Afro-Latinx, sort of at the intersection of many identities there as a Belizean American, and a first-generation person, first-generation American, which I think gives me a healthy skepticism about American and Western culture that I'm very grateful for. So a lot of my work comes back to the fire code, my fire code for my practice, which is called Firebrand. And my friend Jason helped me write this, actually, or helped me turn it into something succinct. So these are 5 sort of core tenets or 5 cornerstones that I'm always referencing in my work when I am making decisions about my work, who to work with, what to do in my work. And the 5 of them are: context is king, we don't design trash, nothing is lost by sharing information, honor the humanity in everyone, and we are not afraid to evolve. So I want to dive a little bit more into context is king, because that one has been so crucial to my teaching and writing practice, but also to my design practice. But before I do that, I just want to hold some gratitude for the ways that I teach and the ways that I learn. I don't see teaching or lecturing as sort of this top-down teacher is the only knowledge holder way of looking at knowledge. I see us all as interconnected. I see everybody as a knowledge holder, and myself as a knowledge holder as well, but also a facilitator. So throughout this presentation, you'll see things that I've learned from many of the people who are here, actually, and some people who are not here because they exist in other places or in other eras and different times. So context is king. This is sort of the longer version of that tenet from the Fire Code. And it reads, we recognize that our creative practice is part of the ongoing continuum of design. We give credit to those who preceded us when we reference their works, and we craft processes and products that are sustainable into the future. So for me, especially giving credit to those who preceded us is so important, because I think that every piece of design is referential of something in the past or the present or maybe the future, references history, references nature, and the world that we live in. And so it's very important to me to understand what those reference points are before I embed them and their energy in the work. So this is what that sort of looks like in visual form, and there are a lot of visual folks here. It means understanding that we live in the present moment, but all of our actions are informed by the past and have some effect on the future. So how do we begin to remember the past and understand how it's going to affect the future? I think when it comes to history, and especially art and design history, it's very easy to think of it as a clean line of events. Many of us have heard, especially in type design, we've heard this, there's a very canned sort of idea or canon of type design history. It starts with the Greeks, and then there was a little Gutenberg, a little Bauhaus, a little modernism, and and now we have Facebook and Apple, hooray. I love this, and I love this presentation by Aggie Toppins from 2020. It's from their lecture on the 4 counter narratives for graphic design history. And they say progress is ideological, and I would say progress in history, the way that it's currently told, is ideological, but human events are actually disjointed, meaning that there are random and semi-random things happening all the time in different places and with different people and cultures, but they don't necessarily all fit neatly into the narratives that we're taught about how design came to be and how our world came to be, our man-made or human-built world. So how does that relate to fonts? Or why is it important to fonts and design? This is a quote that I hear all the time as a website designer, as a UI UX designer, which is, or that I often keep in mind, which is that web design is 95% typography. So as we're scrolling on our phones or our laptops, the majority of what we're interacting with is text. And that's not just web design, that's graphic design, that's in branding, that's in information design and data visualization. A lot of what we're interacting with is typography and font and fonts and typefaces. So if type makes design and designers make the world, like literally build the world that we live in, whether that's digitally or physically, then it's really important that type as a essential ingredient to design is selected and created and curated intentionally. Does anybody know what this is? Feel free to drop it in the chat. It's a page from a very famous book that is often shown in design history classes. Okay, cool. I was like, I do not see the chat number going up, so that means nobody knows. So this is, or you do know and you don't know that you know. So this is a page from the Gutenberg Bible. And Gutenberg is often, in that ideological version of type design history, is often given sort of the credit for being the person that invented movable type or invented the printing press, which would be very neat and cool, but it's not true. So movable type, there were other people during Gutenberg's era that actually were also creating movable type printing presses, and actually several hundred years prior, Bi Sheng in China was creating movable type for the Chinese language, which has way more characters than the English language. I think there are about 10,000 common characters. And he was creating these out of porcelain and copper. So an incredible undertaking, and something that often gets left out of type design history for the very clean and white version of type. Not to mention the leaving out of indigenous peoples and their writing systems and their information design systems. had the honor, some of my ancestors are Mayan, and I had the honor of seeing the Mayan Codex in person at the Getty of all places, but it was so incredible to be able to see a document that has survived so much of time and just the elements, but also has survived colonialism and has survived a really intentional erasure of these documents that had spiritual meaning, that were calendars and ways of connecting and communing with nature. A lot of Western scientists and anthropologists have tried to decode the Mayan Codex, and I often find myself thinking about maybe even if they could translate it or decode it, they wouldn't be able to understand it. Maybe this is a writing system or an information system that wasn't made for them, or that they don't have the cultural context for. So if we're all sort of coming with this same idea or timeline of what type history is, I think it means that we're all bringing the same reference points and the same point of view to the table as designers, as creative people, as researchers. And the danger of that is that we'll all always come up with the same solutions because we have the same reference points. So how do we start to sort of differentiate that? I love this quote from Jose del Barrio. He says, "White privilege is your history being taught as part of the core curriculum, and mine being taught as an elective." And I think about this often. I think about it all the time, the ways that it's very intentional or very negligent that white design history and white type history is sort of seen as the core and the forefront for us, when so much else has happened in the world across different cultures and across time. And I think often the Bauhaus is, and this is one example of the ways that type history is seen through a very specific white lens. The Bauhaus is often always lauded as this like amazing moment in design history of designers and artists coming together and really defining what modern design is, and defining these ideas around like what are the universal principles of design, and what makes something universal and ubiquitous and neutral. But the Bauhaus existed during a time during the Weimar Republic in Germany, which was a time where fascism was coming to a simmer and coming up to a rolling boil. And they positioned themselves as apolitical because the space that they were in, the context that they were in, very relatably, was incredibly conservative and fascist, and they were a state-funded school. So this idea that they were apolitical or neutral from a idealist sort of art for art's sake standpoint doesn't really tell the whole story. And actually in 1933, when Hitler came to power, they disbanded the school. Some people fled the country, and some people went on to use their design skills for the Nazi party. So the apoliticality didn't last very long, or at the end of the day didn't really prepare the students for didn't prepare them for sort of making decisions in this incredibly important world-changing political moment. And some of their beliefs around neutrality are still embedded in our ideas and tenets of design and type design today. This idea that form follows function, and that things should be simplified, and that craftsmen should no longer exist, that things should be easy to mass produce. The idea that if things are ornamental, it's amoral, it's frivolous, comes out of this era. And then, of course, this idea that modernism is universal and that Helvetica is neutral. All of these things we sort of take for granted, but they're coming from a political space and a political context that if we don't sort of dive into it or know about it, we sort of unintentionally carry it forward. So who are we bringing to the table with us? Whose sort of ancestral energy do we carry with us when we carry forward their ideals or when we carry forward their aesthetics? I think for a lot of designers, intentionally or unintentionally, a lot of our reference points are cis white men, and they are an important part of design history, but they're not all of design history. And as I said before, I think if we're all only referencing the same 10 white guys, we're only going to come up with the same 10 solutions every single time. And our world is changing too quickly for us to continue to do that. So what does it look like? Add another slide in here, but it's gone. So what does it look like to decenter Western design or white design in our practices? White history or Western design history often feels like this. It feels like this huge, monolithic, unmovable sort of focal point in our art practices, in our design practices, in museum spaces, in our institutions. But it's actually one of many intersecting pieces of design that has been done by humans on Earth across time. So not just Europe, but on all continents, anywhere that humans are existing, design is happening. It's not necessarily being seen as design or treated as design or preserved the way that Western design history has been, but it's just as important. So how can we start to fill in our personal canon, fill in these other interrelated or completely diverse and different pieces of design history that are not just Western? And here's a little, we're going to take a little quick break and zoom in on a particular part of American type history. So in my during my type program, there was a revival project. And so a revival project is where you take old type that was made in the past and you update it for the digital medium. So you're taking something that was previously only printed on paper with metal type or wood type, and you're turning it into a digital typeface where you can type on the computer. And I was like, oh, cool. So were there any Black metal type designers, anybody who is African-American who designed metal type? And my teacher was like, no, not that I know of. And my first question to that is, why is that? Why is that? And I got really curious about the history of that specific era that type design was in, and who was making type and who wasn't making type and why. So in my research, I was looking at this research done, published in the Black Scholar in 1977 by James E. Newton, where he talks about African-American craftsmen and artisans and all of the different skills that they had. I think often when we talk about the history of slavery and enslaved folks, we only talk about the agricultural side of things. We don't talk about the craftsmen and the people who were doing all of the other jobs that were considered too dangerous or too arduous by white people for them to do themselves. And he refers to these Black craftsmen as the first technocrats in the New World. So I have this list. It's not a full list, but it's a list of all of the different, many of the different types of jobs that Black people held. And I highlighted all of the ones that would have transferable skills for metal type design or for wood type design. So there were Black printers, there were sign painters, there were copper and silversmiths, there were chain makers, there were jewelry makers, there were tool makers and draftsmen. And all of these people have skills that are related to making physical type, to making metal type. And so it makes sense to me, or the logical conclusion is that even though it was illegal for slaves to read and write, they might have been cutting metal type and printing type and creating posters and printed pieces. And the history of type, manufactured type, is interrelated to slavery, because it's deeply connected to commerce. So, you know, we were told to sort of look at these beautiful specimens of type design and woodblock type, and then not really consider what they might have been used for. But there are so many examples of wood type and metal type being used for slave auctions and being used for advertisements for runaway slaves. And I think it's important to remember, again, thinking about a broader context of type design and type history, that type has always played a role in business and commerce, and by extension, a role in the oppression of folks. And so I'm trying to do the survival project, and I have all of this in my head where I'm thinking about, so Black people's relationship to type actually was like a very tenuous one and a very violent one. And a lot of the people who were escaped slaves, who might have been printers or type cutters or were living in the Jim Crow era, weren't even allowed to sort of use their skills outside of their job, or outside of having a white overseer or a white boss. But despite that, many of them figured out how to use design and to use type actually for liberation. And I love this poster that is about an organization started by ex-slaves, people who escaped slavery or were freed or bought their way to freedom. And this is actually like a mutual aid group. It's so incredible to me to think, you know, mutual aid feels like such a new concept, and we like to treat it as a new concept, but mutual aid has always been a part of Black American history, and it will always continue to be a part of Black American history and broader American history. So how do we start to fill in our personal canon? This is what mine looks like. And you'll notice that on the bottom, European design or Western design is still included in my own sort of galaxy of reference points. But it's alongside, and I think equally weighted to, all of these other pieces. So firstly, and most importantly, as designers, I think it's important for us to understand our own positionality, what we care about, what our value systems are, what our biases are, as we're looking at these references and as we're creating new things to add to the world. So other than European design, I'm starting to learn about African design and broadening my ideas and knowledge around Black American design. I'm looking at hyperlocal design in Los Angeles and in Inglewood and in my neighborhood, and the ways that type and fonts and lettering are being used here. I'm looking at indigenous wisdom. I don't think we're going to have the future that we want without looking at the wisdom of people who have been communing with the earth and understanding how to respect it for thousands of years. I don't think we're going to make it into the next era if we don't listen to them. Latinx design, craft and folk art, which was often done by women and not considered to be design. Magic, biomimicry, and looking at nature and the way that nature solves design problems. So this is a quote from that essay I wrote that I mentioned my class was named after. And it says, "If my being queer and Black makes my type design choices loud, then maybe it's type for shouting. Maybe this type is speaking Creole or Ave, and not MLA or good English. Maybe this type isn't talking to you and the conversation isn't about you." So I want to talk a little bit through my work and how all this headiness and knowledge and history and philosophy is actually applying to the way that I'm pushing the pixels around, and the way that I'm sketching and the way that I'm creating type. This is one of the first projects I did when I started Firebrand in 2020. I was working with a local healer and herbalist based in LA, and I had done some initial rounds of logos where I was trying to make it super friendly and cute, and they saw the first round of logo ideas and they were like, so my overarching feedback is, can we make it more brown and more queer? And I read the email and I sat back in my chair and I was like, no one in any of my time as a student, as a professional, in any project I had worked on, no coworkers or friends or clients had ever asked me to make something more like myself, to make something more like us that felt like us. And it really struck me, and it really gave me, I think, a North Star and a place to kind of point to for the rest of my practice. So I'm really grateful to this client. And we were inspired by Greca patterns that are on the side of Mayan temples, like these stone sort of almost pixel art patterns. And so the piece of the word that means cure, that means to cure or to heal, we took that and turned it into these kind of patterns that you could stack and block together. And I drew this typeface by hand, actually on graph paper, and then vectorized it. I also do lettering. This was a really fun piece, exploring the ways that I could sort of embed history into the design of the type, into the illustration. Biomimicry and looking at the ways that the logo could be inspired by this mascot for this immigration law firm, which was this avocet migratory water bird. Seeing how I could pull its shapes into the custom typeface for the logo. And then we recently launched the Black Wealth Data Center and have been referencing W.E.B. Du Bois, who is a Black sociologist and who had such an incredible eye for him and his students, had such an incredible eye for data visualization and such a different way of thinking about it, that wasn't just pie charts and wasn't just bar charts. And he brought in so much beautiful color and texture. And so referencing him, referencing his type design through actually a revival that was done by Trey Seals of Vocal Type. Creating packaging that's referencing Black design history through jazz album art, actually through Blue Note Records, and turning that into packaging for a coffee brand that's tagline is coffee, community, and culture. And creating collages that are all focused in and around Black aesthetics and Black faces, and a color palette that pops and is radiant against our skin. Trying my hand at some digital embroidery for this Peruvian roast, because Peru is known for its beautiful history and traditions of embroidery. And then creating type, of course. This was a font that I created and named after Octavia Butler, and this is my favorite quote from her. Everything you touch, you change. Everything you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. And then creating posters and fake movie posters using that typeface. Somebody please hit up A24 and tell them that I want them to use my font. And creating creating more and more work sort of around this typeface, or around this idea of Afrofuturism. And I'm hoping to finally print and publish this book this year. And then type design has also affected my illustration practice. The way that I am thinking about positive and negative space has really changed because of type design. And trying to break some of the rules of type design as well. One of the rules is counter space, which is the interior spaces, like in an O or an A. Counter space should equal letter space, which is the space around the letters. And I wanted to create a typeface that didn't follow that rule, but was still readable. And this one was really inspired by bubble letters and graffiti, but also by afros and clouds and daydreaming. March for Black Women, bringing in fonts or bringing in different letter forms that represent all of the diverse bodies that march together. And then I'm currently working on another revival, actually, of Aaron Douglas's work. He was an incredible illustrator and lettering artist, and I wanted to create a typeface that is based on the style that he often used in his book cover design. And I love this font so much. I think it has such a great rhythm. The way that he brings in these triangles and brings in the S's that are sort of almost diagonal. This is a quote from a friend of mine, Kaylin. She said this at her film screening a couple of days ago, and I've been thinking about it. The way that the melanin in our skin connects us to the earth and to the soil. And she said that Earth is speaking to us right now on a global level through Black and brown women, through the women who are doing community work and doing organizing and activism work. Those women are the translators and sort of mediums for the earth. And I think there's sort of a global shifting of power that's happening right now that Black and brown women are leading. So let's see, it's 10:40. I do want there to be time for questions, so I'm going to go through this next section a little bit quickly. We might stay a little bit longer at the end, if that's okay. So design that remembers. This was a project I worked on a couple of years ago called Mindfulness for the People. And MFP creates emotional media that centers Black folks who are coping with everyday microaggressions and racial battle fatigue. And as I was starting to design the identity for this, I kept thinking about this thing that my client said, which was that Black peoples have passed down mindfulness and self-care practices for many generations. And she was talking about all of the different ways that Black people have coped and survived despite all of the violence, despite oppression, despite erasure, and how we have taken care of ourselves and each other communally. Around the same time, I had read African Alphabets by Saki Mafundikwa, and I saw this Bantu pictogram system. And I noticed that there were these two symbols, which are highlighted in yellow, for the brain and the mind, and that they were separate symbols. Like this old language already had this idea that there's the brain, the organ, the physical thing that exists, and then there's the mind, which is similar but separate. And so I wanted to honor the fact that this concept has already existed for us, has existed for Black folks in different parts of the world, Black folks that we might be interrelated to. And so this was the icon that I came up with. It was sort of a melding of the brain and the mind, because MFP is a practice about mental health as much as like physical embodiment. And then for the logo type, I used Trey Seal's VTC Martin, which is based on these protest posters that were from protests from the civil rights movement, of people, declaring that they deserved rights. They deserved to be treated well as workers. And as Black workers, they weren't receiving the same protections that white workers were receiving. So this was the final word mark, and then the final lockup. And then that icon became sort of a motif that we use throughout the brand to represent mental space, to have these images and videos and moving images above the person's head to sort of show you where they're at mentally. And then there's design that invokes. I think when we are intentional about what we reference and the energies that we pull into our design, that magic can happen. So this was a personal project, and I had watched Paris is Burning for the first time last year. And I just sort of fell in love with this woman in the film, Octavia St. Laurent, who was a model and AIDS educator. She was active in New York City's Black and Latino ballroom scene in the 80s and 90s. And ballroom is responsible for so much of the queer culture that we have today. Everything from RuPaul's Drag Race to Renaissance, to Beyonce's Renaissance, and all of the queer history and aesthetics that she pulled into that. All of that is because these Black and brown people insisted on existing. And I get really emotional about it, because I think right now, especially right now in the US, trans folks and people who do drag and people who are queer are under attack. And so I watched the film and I saw this quote from the film, and she said, "I want to be a household name." Octavia said, "Someday I want everybody to know my name." And so I was like, how can I help this transester, this queer elder, make that come true? And so I started pulling in sort of all of these reference points, my own queer experience, Black American design, Art Nouveau, the film. And I listened to Renaissance, I think, on repeat, and created this poster, this portrait of her. And one of my huge reference points, which I highly recommend, and shout out to Ash for showing me this book, this amazing book of interviews of folks from sort of the peak ballroom era. And this person pictured is Willie Ninja, who invented voguing and who actually choreographed Madonna's Vogue. And then I was thinking about these posters that were also very popular in the 90s by Patrick Nagel. And I always was sort of in love with this design style. I think we all had like a cool aunt or a cool uncle who you would go into their house in the 90s and you're like, that's like a gorgeous woman on that poster. But he always drew women that were like alabaster white. And I was like, okay, part of the aesthetic, but not the like pure whiteness. So I wanted to create custom type for the poster for Octavia's name. And this is a little bit of my process. It started out as a sketch, pretty funky. You can see this is my initial digital version of the typeface, and then how I eventually refined it in RoboFonts. I was testing out some other letters as well. And then doing the illustration completely in black and white so that I could print it on a risograph machine. And this is the level of detail and devotion that I went into, like in the Beyonce zone, alien superstar, like full on, just making this entire illustration in a day. And you guys can ask my partner Aizel. It was truly like an act of devotion and commitment. And then getting that printed out on the Rizzo machine, and you can see how I'm starting to layer the green and the pink and then the yellow on top here. And this was the final poster. So it had this custom type for her name, as well as my typeface Octavia. And all of these really beautiful moments of magic happened with color layering, and sort of like seeing the colors come apart and go back together felt very trippy and very house, which is also a genre rooted in Black music history. And then sometimes design is magic. So my friend Mo and I were printing on the same machine on the same day. And these were some of the test sheets that we had run through. And we did not talk about our designs beforehand. But somehow the shape language of them, Mo was also referencing Art Nouveau, and just the way, especially the one on the left printed, where everything aligns and like her third eye is lit up with this talisman, and the A is referencing, is similar to the way that the Ouija board indicator is shaped. I think it was just a moment of like design and art magic, that we were sort of like on this same, on the same wavelength. And then lastly, design that rests. How can we incorporate rest as an act of resistance into our practices as creative people? So the Nap Ministry is disrupting and pushing back against capitalism and white supremacy by connecting to the liberating power of rest. And I reached out to the Nap Ministry because I had a dream in the summer of 2021 that I opened a church that was like a rest temple. It was a place where anybody could come and just take a nap and they would be safe and their things would be safe. So I had that dream. And then at the beginning of 2022, I saw the Nap Ministry post that she was gifted a church building in Atlanta and a space for her to be able to house her practice, to house the Nap Ministry. And she was calling it the Rest Temple. And so I was like, I literally just dreamt about this. And so I emailed her and I was like, hey, any way that I could be of service, please let me know. And she emailed me back and she was like, yeah, let's work on something together. And that first something was sort of a revamp of her visual identity. But it was because I had sort of followed my intuition and taken this thing that I thought would only exist in the dream space, the idea of the sleep church, and communed with somebody who was building that in real life. But I was at the time in like such a space of burnout and really I knew that I couldn't create anything for this particular client from a space of being unrested or a space of being burnt out. And so I actually sat with this project for a long time. And I sat with it until after Trisha's book came out, which is called Rest is Resistance, a Manifesto. And in the book, she kept saying, rest is our North Star, rest is our North Star. And it reminded me that I had learned from Trey, actually, about the North Star icon that was stitched into quilts that were used on the Underground Railroad. So our ancestors, my Black ancestors, were so incredibly brilliant and ingenious. They made an entire wayfinding system out of old pieces of cloth that they sewed together. And these different symbols would mean, you can stop here for food. Now is the time to collect supplies for the journey. Head this way, don't go that way. But the North Star meant you're headed in the right direction. You're headed toward your own freedom and liberation. And so I kept reading in the book about this North Star, and I was like, oh, Trish is going to flip, because the idea of the North Star, like there's already existing graphic language around that. So we incorporated the North Star as the main icon for the Nap Ministry, and I love that it's on quilts, which are so simple and so lovingly made, but also are bedding and that are used for rest. And then I knew that I wanted to make something custom for the typeface for Nap Ministry as well, because again, none of the existing type that I saw felt like it fully embodied all of what Trisha was is saying through her work. So this is a quote from her book. "This work is about rage, my tender rage about what the systems have done to my body. This work is a tender rage originating from ancestral rage that has been unspoken and hidden." And so that's sort of the reasoning behind the name of the typeface, and the vibe of the typeface was supposed to be both soft and strong and bold, and restful. And so I was inspired by old metal type that has grown soft over time, or the edges have softened over time because of age or because of use. And I was inspired by tent revivals, and sign painting and protest signs. And this is the current character set. And so it has a little bit of boldness and wideness, and I think a lot of balance and sturdiness to it, but at the same time, all of the edges are softened and restful. So here's how it looks a little larger. You can really see where there's this combination of soft and hard. And these are all quotes from Trisha's work and book. And then lastly, and most importantly, if you haven't taken time to rest today or this weekend, please lay your ass down and take some time to rest. I think that allowing ourselves, especially as creatives, as activists and healers, allowing ourselves to rest is so incredibly key to connecting to our larger purposes and connecting to the clarity that we want to have about our practice and what we're making as designers. So thank you guys so much. That is the end of my talk. I'm sorry I went a little long, but this is something for you to reflect on as you kind of move through your day and through hopefully many of your days. What histories do you invoke and who do you carry forward? All right, thank you.
Thank you so much. I feel like there's so many emotions in the chat. Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. We're just so very grateful for you being so generous in sharing all of your practice and your work, and just so thankful. And I would love to ask you some questions from the crowd.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
Anusha, apologies in advance if I mispronounce anyone's names. Anusha asks, how do you define self-care and community care, and how do you practice it in your day-to-day as a professional, a human being?
Yeah, thank you for asking that, Anusha. First, I think that self-care and community care are very tied to each other. I think especially a lot of my clients are activists and organizers, and it's so important that they take care of themselves, and that anybody doing sort of movement work takes care of themselves, because without us the work doesn't get done, you know. And it feels it's really easy, I think, even as people who are trying to like make positive change in the world, to like fall into grind culture or hustle culture, where it's like it's all about me. I have to keep going like 24/7 because the work is important. But like I said, like listening to for me, self-care is like ultimately, or firstly, I think listening to my body and what it needs, and like accepting when I'm tired and doing something to rest. I think in my work as a designer, it's really seeing my clients and seeing that especially because of the pandemic and like the stress of the past few years, like many of them are maxed out, like many of them are burnt out because they're working really hard. So in my collaboration with them, how can I create a space of ease, a space of gentleness for them, a space of understanding. So that's what I would say, is listening to your body and being very kind to the healers and the community workers that I think are taking us to the next version of what the human world is going to be.
Thank you. Our next question was from the chat from Kalan Wilson. Schessa, you've shown us many references of who and how we can bring to the table. Do you have any websites or links of Black design history, or have you seen any kind of reference site for us?
Yeah, sure. So if you want to take a course, there is Silas's BIPOC design history. And it's not just Black design history, it's also queer design, it's also Central and South American design. Actually, Juan taught one of the courses. So that is a great space to start with. Yeah, it's incredible. Like I have yet to dive into all of the history lessons, but there are literally so many now, and I know that that's growing as we speak. There's also the People's Graphic Design Archive that Louise Sandhouse started, and anybody can add to that. It's a collectively made archive, and so there are a lot of diverse design references in there, and more like ephemera and things that weren't necessarily seen as like high design at the time.
Thank you. And for folks, if you aren't looking in the chat, Juan is dropping in all the links, so you have them ready to go. So check that out. Our next question is from Sophia. Do you have any practical ideas on building our own practice codes, aka your fire code?
Yeah, sure. I think so the fire code is it's like 10 sentences now, but it started out as like a 10-page essay, like a 10-page manifesto that I kind of wrote in 2020 when I was seeing folks kind of like co-opting the Black Lives Matter movement and being like, I'll do beautiful lettering about it, but then just wanting to get credit for like being like quote unquote woke. And so I had a lot of feelings about it, and like we weren't doing any sort of like activist work or protest. And so I think if you're really in your feelings about something, writing about it, journaling about it is where I would say to start. Is like just like literally like venting all of your feelings about something, and then going back and rereading it a few days later, and seeing what themes emerge, and seeing what you care about, like what you really care about, and then taking that and turning it into like 3 to 5 sentences. That was my process.
Thank you. I mean, you can see the love in the chat. Everyone just loves your fire code so much. It's so inspiring. We have another question from Mo. Mm-hmm. As you mentioned, Western art school can be a really limiting space to grow as an artist when the core reference points being taught are from straight, white, cis men. What were your greatest resources for developing your relationship with type outside of that kind of academic environment?
My greatest resources have been my friends who are really, really big nerds. So some of them are here. Justin Smith from Afrovisualism is here. Terrell is here. Jason is here or was here very recently from Burnt Sienna Research Society. Tashika, Cheryl D. Miller, Trey Seals. So much of what I have learned has been from other people who are also really nerdy about alternate design histories and Black and Brown design histories. So I would say part of it is tapping into the nerds in your community. And part of it is also opening up your definitions around like what type or art can be. I think a lot of what we have now is like high design history or high art, fine art history is heavily curated by white men, and they were like, well, this is our standard and our definition of like what art and design are, and so anything that falls outside of that, we're not going to put it in the textbook. So I think if you can open up and intentionally ask yourself, like, who's being erased in this version of history, where might I look that is not like a formal institution for design or art for my reference points, and where can you look in your own, in your own like family tree for, or your own town, your own hometown, for things that are designed but aren't necessarily fancy or like high design.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, such great golden advice. So thankful. We have another question from Prant. How do we encourage more people to make type for African, Native American, and other indigenous writing systems?
That's a really hard question. I think part of it, so I was really excited at the end of my class, which is another great place to learn alternate design history. I was really excited to see a lot of my students deciding to tap into their own histories and their own identities that were not white or not straight. And I think a lot of what allowed them to do that was through giving them like space and permission to take their own critical lens to design history, to the things that they've been taught. I'm going to read your question again to make sure. Oh gosh, it's gone. So I think for Black and Brown designers, it's encouraging us to look at our own histories. I think for other folks, it might be getting out of the way of Black and Brown type designers, actually. Is a huge one, is passing the mic, passing the funding over, passing the resources over. And the other thing I will say is, like, Unicode heavily controls what is considered like a writing system that's worth making a font for. Yeah, get off the mic, exactly. Exactly. And so I think as much as we can pressure our institutions code and TDC and all of these other kind of old boys clubs to be more inclusive and to include more languages, I think the better. And I think type nerds are exactly the right people to do that, because we're very passionate about very specific things.
That's so true. Thank you, Schessa, so much. I mean, again, this has just been such a great session. I've learned so much. Everyone has learned so much. We all just am very thankful for you sharing your practice with us and sharing just so much amazing advice. Yes, lots of love in the chat as well.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you for coming, everyone. I really appreciate all of you for coming out. I'm like reading the chat. I hope you heard something today that made you think, oh, I want to know more about that, or what's the history of the place where I live, or the place that my people come from. Like, that's the starting point. I think that's where you'll get really excited to make things that are for you and about you and for the rest of us. So thank you guys.
Thank you.
All
right, everyone, have a
great.
Yeah, so much love.
Thank you so much, Schessa. That was beautiful.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah.
All right, everybody, have a lovely day.
Right,
have
everybody.
a nice weekend. Get some rest.
Have a
Bye, everyone.
Get some lovely rest. All right, bye, everyone.